For Ukrainian nationalists, January 1st is one of the most important days in their calendar. It marks the birth of Stepan Bandera.
This BBC report is 9 years old. It contrasts sharply with reporting now. Back then, Western media wasn't censored to the degree it is now.
But for many in Ukraine and abroad, Bandera's legacy is controversial. His group, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, sided with Nazi German forces before breaking with them later in the war. Western historians also say that his followers carried out massacres of Polish and Jewish civilians. Protesters marched amidst a river of torches and signs saying, "Ukraine above all else."
In the 9 years since, these nationalists and their ideology would go on to infect almost every facet of Ukrainian government and life. This ideology would bring the world the closest it has been to World War III.
What should NATO do? Eliminate the possibility of Russia using nuclear weapons. We need preventive strikes so they know what will happen to them if they use nukes and not the other way around.
History repeats. Ukrainian nationalists have always been used as a tool. Fanatics given guns and money in order to sow chaos for 100 years. Then it was the Ukrainian military organization, headquartered in Berlin, funded by the German military intelligence, and ordered to stage acts of terror against Poles and Russians. Its leader, Yevgeny Konovalets, was, if anything, frank.
Preparations for the Holy Crusade against the Soviet Union will intensify. There must be terror, our German friends tell us, not as a goal, but as a tool to control the masses.
Later, they became the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, supported and trained by Hitler's Nazi Germany and Mussolini's fascist Italy. They murdered hundreds of thousands of Poles and Russians and Jews. They too chanted, "Glory to Ukraine."
The Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists under Stepan Bandera leads not only the struggle for independence of Ukraine, but for the collapse and destruction of the Moscow Empire.
Fast forward to today. Torchlit marches across the country. Nazi collaborators hailed as national heroes. Zelensky's own bodyguards wear Hitler's SS Galicia division emblems. They are just as brutal as their predecessors. Social media has been flooded, showing nationalist brutality, execution of pro-Russian civilians, soldiers gouging out prisoners' eyes, and even worse, armed to the teeth with NATO weapons and existing entirely on Western funding, just like old times.
The Russian Federation will be demolished in the form that it is now in. In the summer, we will see a very different picture on the front lines and in other areas. We will see what lands will belong to whom after the war.
This is the West's modus operandi. Whether it's the Gestapo, the British intelligence, or America's CIA, they have always used fanatics and extremists, sometimes without their knowledge. Take the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. It was born in the pits of US prisons and camps in Iraq.
Extremists had freedom to educate the young detainees. I saw them giving courses using classroom boards on how to use explosives, weapons, and how to become suicide bombers. For the Americans, we felt it was normal. They did not stop them.
Radicalization was open and permitted, say detainees. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the man who essentially established ISIS in its monstrous form, did so under the watch of US guards. Almost all of ISIS's top leadership met and radicalized at Camp Bucca.
It wasn't a prison. It was a camp where CIA succeeded in preparing the first line of leaders for ISIS. It is just a place to organize those groups and to be ready to get in to fight against Syria or another places. CIA needs to send them. These groups are don't have the ability, or there's no way for them to be alone in this area. They need the supporting from the outside.
Whether by negligence or design, the United States unleashed on the world a pestilence that killed hundreds of thousands and traumatized tens of millions. It wasn't just turning a blind eye. Vast amounts of US and British-supplied weaponry ended up in the hands of ISIS. An ISIS propaganda video from Yemen showed fighters with weapons and munitions that were recently purchased by a US army contractor and destined for Afghanistan. Bulgarian journalists tracked how these arms got there and concluded that it would have been virtually impossible without the Pentagon's knowledge.
As I said before, the US is behind establishing terrorist organizations. It is known to the world that the CIA confessed that Al-Qaeda was created by the American intelligence agency. Also in Iraq, ISIS was created in the presence of the American and British troops who had invaded. There is an American project based on terrorist groups to destabilize the region and reform it to serve the known American Zionist project of dividing the region, to empower the Israeli control and achieve the American and Western interests in the region.
The fact is, ISIS divided Syria. It seized the oil-rich east, which is now occupied by US troops. Oil has been denied to the Syrian government and is instead pumped out and sold with American oversight. The winner is clear. And now Russia fears surviving ISIS fighters are being directed to a new theater of war.
Amid the backdrop of a military defeat in Syria and Iraq, ISIL is transporting forces elsewhere, namely to Afghanistan. The United States is interested in sparking new conflicts in Central Asia to realize its own geopolitical goals and is actively complicit in this process.
Named the Islamic State of Khorasan province, they appeared in Afghanistan out of nowhere, quickly growing in power and waging a campaign of bloodshed as senseless as it was brutal. Hamid Karzai, who served as president of Afghanistan for 12 years during the US occupation, believes firmly that the US and the Islamic State's appearance are linked.
You have said, quote, I do not differentiate at all between Daesh and America. You've said ISIL is, quote, a US tool and that unmarked military helicopters are supplying ISIL in Afghanistan. Do you have even a shred of evidence for what are pretty controversial and inflammatory claims?
The evidence is, sir, in the fact that they are there, in spite of the US presence in Afghanistan to fight extremism. Extremism is a tool in the hands of the United States. They did it when we were fighting the Soviets, the same tool. They're using it in a bigger way now today.
But the United States is gone, defeated by an organization that for 2 decades they tried to malign and destroy. It falls now to the Taliban to fight America's veritable creation.
The infidel group ISIL has absolutely no roots in Afghan society. You can't find any evidence of such kind of ideology in our history. Unfortunately, some people have become part of the organization in recent years in some parts of our country. As you know, the Taliban government took immediate action. We completely destroyed their stronghold in Zabul. Our helicopters hit them in Jawzjan, and we attacked them in Kunar and Jalalabad. Many of them were killed in our military operations in different parts of the country.
The Taliban wages war on the Islamic State Khorasan, all but alone. As was Syria, Afghanistan is crippled by American sanctions. It makes the fight so much harder. Poverty and hunger caused by sanctions only serve to aid ISIS-K and intensify suffering among civilians. The United States understands this.
Well, the infidel terrorist group ISIS is being financed and used by other countries for their interests. By malicious political design, the United States is using anti-Taliban forces to destabilize Kabul for an opportunity to interfere again. No doubt their withdrawal from Afghanistan after 2 decades of war was a humiliation for them. Now they have no choice but to organize opponents of the Taliban government. No group would be able to execute such big attacks without huge financial and political support from abroad. We know there are a few countries that have recruited, trained, financed and then sent them here to fight against the government. Of course, ISIS is one of these organizations.
Whatever America's aims in Afghanistan, be it revenge on the Taliban for an embarrassing defeat, or a desire to deny the area to Chinese or Russian projects, it is facing pushback. The Taliban understands well how deadly this threat is and is likely getting help.
Constructive relations between Russia's Federal Security Service and our international partners in Central Asia are helping to uncover and thwart terrorist activity.
Be it the Islamic State in Afghanistan or ultranationalists in Ukraine, whether they know it or not, they are tools, age-old tools in a war hundreds of years old between the West and the East. A war waged by the West in the name of decency and humanity, but that hides an absolute disregard for life and suffering.